Namaskar. So we have been discussing the introductory idea of evolution of psychological thought in the West. And already we have discussed three stages of evolution and about two psychological forces out of four forces. The first stage in the West, psychological thought began its journey in the West as a philosophical inquiry, into the nature of human being. So this was the first stage. Psychological thought began its journey as a philosophical inquiry into the nature of human being. And in the second stage, psychology emerged as an independent field of study in its own right and as an empirical science, and it is also known as empirical science or experimental psychology, and it was emerged in 1879. So psychology as an independent field of study, as an empirical science, by German psychologist Wilhelm Ondet in 1879. Uh, it was also known as strictly laboratory science. It was known as strictly as a laboratory science. It was also known as brass instrument psychology. Why brass instrument psychology? Because of the centrality of scientific instruments. It is also called brass instrument psychology. And what it studied? It studied only the superficial aspect of human behavior. Uh, uh, which are actually bordering on physiology rather than psychology, bordering on physiology, such as reaction time, condition reflexes, perpetual function, attention span, localization of function, etc. So then the earliest school of modern psychology. It is also referred to as introspection or structuralism. The earliest school of modern psychology, called structuralism, also known as introspection, closely associated with the work of Titchener. And what it tried to discover? The earliest school tried to discover the elements of consciousness through experiment and introspective analysis. Introspective analysis means আত্মানুসন্ধান। কি বিচাৰিছিল, কি আৱিষ্কাৰ কৰিবলৈ খুজিছিল? এলিমেন্টস অফ কনচিয়াছনেছ, চেতনাৰ উপাদানসমূহ। কিন্তু এই গোটেইখিনি যিখিনি আৰ্লিয়েষ্ট পাৰ্ট অফ psychological evolution in the West, সেই ক্ষেত্ৰত মহাৰিষিয়ে কৈছে যে formerly it was a crude, scholastic and superficial systematization of man's ignorance of himself. Actually, psychology means as a man's ignorance. The surface psychological functioning, will, mind, senses, reason, conscience, etc. were arranged in a dry and sterile classification. Their real nature and relation to each other were not fathomed. So this was the three stages of psychological evolution in the West. First three stages. Then the first systematic attempt, about which we did discuss in our last session. So it was the first systematic attempt, which is also known as depth psychology or psychoanalysis or reductionism or depth psychology. It is known by all these three names. It is psychoanalysis, depth psychology, or it is known as reductionism. এই তিনিটা নামৰ দ্বাৰাই ইয়াক জনা যায়, and it was founded by Sigmund Freud. It was founded by Sigmund Freud, and it is called the first systematic attempt. First systematic attempt. Why it is first systematic attempt? Why it is first systematic attempt? Because Sri Aurobindo observed that the knowledge only begins. When knowledge begins? When we get away from the surface phenomena and look behind them for their true operation and causes. যেতিয়া আমি তাৰ বাহ্য অৰ্থৰ পৰা যেতিয়া তাৰ অন্তৰালৰ অৰ্থলৈ যাবলৈ প্ৰয়াস কৰোঁ, তেতিয়াহে আমি আচল জ্ঞান লাভ কৰোঁ। যি ধৰণে এসময়ত কোৱা হৈছিল যে সূৰ্যটো পৃথিৱীৰ চাৰিওফালে ঘূৰে, দিছ ৱাজ দি ছাৰফেচ ফেনোমেনা। কিন্তু যেতিয়া মহাৰিষিয়ে কৈছে but the scientific inquiry comes and knocks this infantile first view to pieces, তাক চূৰ্ণ বিচূৰ্ণ কৰি দিলে। চূৰ্ণ বিচূৰ্ণ কৰি দি কি ক'লে? The sun is a huge affair. Sound is a huge affair around which the small earth circles. আৰু আমি তৰাবোৰক কি কৈছিলো? যেন তৰাবোৰ ৰাতি আকাশত তীৰ বিৰাই থাকে, যেন মানুহৰ উপকাৰৰ বাবে। কিন্তু যেতিয়া বিজ্ঞান আহিল, বিজ্ঞানে আমাক ক'লে কি? Stars are huge members of huge system, indescribably distant, which have nothing apparently do with the tiny earth and her creatures. তাক অবৰ্ণনীয়ভাৱে বৰ্ণনাতীতভাৱে হিউজ ঘটনা এইবোৰ। আৰু কৈছে যে আর হিউজ মেম্বাৰ্স অফ এ হিউজ চিষ্টেম, এই ক্ষুদ্ৰ পৃথিৱীৰ সৈতে সেইবোৰৰ কোনো সম্বন্ধই নাই। তেনেহ'লে কৈছে যে আমি তেতিয়ালৈকে শুদ্ধ জ্ঞান নাপাওঁ যেতিয়ালৈকে উই আৰ নট গেটিং এৱে ফ্ৰম দি সাৰ্ফেচ ফেনোমেনা এণ্ড লুক বিহাইণ্ড দেম ফৰ দিয়াৰ ট্ৰু অপাৰেশ্যন এণ্ড কজেছ। আৰু সেইবাবে কৈছে যে এই যিটো সিগমুণ্ড ফ্ৰয়েডে যিটো প্ৰথম যিটো এই সাইকো এনালাইসিস বা ডেপথ সাইকোলজি বা যিটো বুজা যায় রিডাকশনিজম বুলি, আমি রিডাকশনিজম কিয় কোৱা হয়, ডেপথ সাইকোলজি কিয় কোৱা হয়, আমি ইতিমধ্যে আলোচনা কৰিছো। কৈছে it was the first systematic attempt. Sigmund Freud's this first systematic attempt, and it is known as depth psychology, and it is one of the four forces of Western psychology. It is known as the first force of Western psychology. The first systematic attempt to get away from the surface phenomena and look behind them for their true operation and causes was made by psychoanalysis founded by Sigmund Freud. Why it is getting away from the surface phenomena? Because the primary emphasis of this psychoanalysis, or for that matter depth psychology or this reductionism, on unconscious, not on conscious. So the primary emphasis on unconscious led to a reactionary movement. No, this is not. So psychoanalysis, why it is called psychoanalysis? Because the first systematic attempt was made by psychoanalysis founded by Sigmund Freud. And according to him, mind is like an iceberg. Iceberg মানে কি? হিমবা। সাগৰৰ ওপৰত তাৰ অলপমান ওলাই থকা আইচবাৰ্গৰ দৰে। কৈছে মনটো যিটো আমাৰ বাহ্যিক মন কেৱল মাত্ৰ অলপমানহে বাহিৰত ওলাই থাকে। 90% it is composed of unconscious. কি কৈছে? যে the mind is like an iceberg. Number one, Freud কৈছে 9/10 of it lies below the surface of the conscious mind, and it is known as unconscious. So our conscious mind is only 10% of the mind. 9/10 lies below the surface of the conscious mind. অর্থাৎ আমাৰ যিটো আমি মন বুলি কওঁ সেইটোৰ কেৱল মাত্ৰ 10% বাহিৰত থাকে, 90% ভিতৰত থাকে, তলত থাকে, ভিতৰত থাকে বুলি কৈছে। আৰু এই ভিতৰত থকা 90% অংশটোক ফ্ৰয়েডে কি বুলি কৈছে? আনকনচিয়াছ বুলি কৈছে। and it is inaccessible to introspection. Our pratham, the earliest school of psychology in West was known as introspection. So that school tried to discover the elements of consciousness through introspection, and through experiment. But now Freud says that this unconscious is not accessible to introspection. Atmanusandhaনৰ বাবে এই 90% উপলব্ধ নহয়. It is inaccessible to introspection. Though it is inaccessible to introspection, yet it is the most powerful determinant. And real cause of outward behavior. Freud কৈছে সেইভাবে এটুক psychoanalysis বুলি কৈছে first systematic attack. Is it not getting away from the surface phenomena? অর্থাৎ বাহিৰত মনে যেটো ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছে তাৰ পৰা আতৰি আহিবলৈ যত্ন কৰা হৈছে it is getting away from the surface phenomena and look behind them for their true operation and causes. So Freud looks at unconscious, which is almost 9/10 of our mind. So yet it is the most powerful determinant and real cause of outward behavior. And Sri Aurobindo hails the new depth psychology as an advancement. Sri Aurobindo hails this psychology as an advancement. Why? Why it was an advancement? For its attempt was to get away from the surface phenomena and look behind for their true operation. And because of this, though it also suffers serious drawbacks, still Sri Aurobindo hails the new depth psychology as an advancement. So next, in the last session, we discussed about behaviorism. Behaviorism is the second force of psychology in the West. Out of four force, behaviorism is the second force. First force is psychoanalysis, or you may call it depth psychology, or you may call it reductionism, founded by Sigmund Freud. It is based on unconscious. Unconscious is the real determinant of our outward behavior. It is getting away from the surface phenomena and look behind for their true operations. So now the second force in psychology, and it is called behaviorism. So what is this behaviorism? Though we did discuss in our last session, let us have a recap. Because these four is the foundation of modern psychology, Western psychology. First one is called psychoanalysis, founded by Freud, followed by behaviorism. What is this behaviorism? So the primary emphasis on unconscious led to a reactionary movement. So behaviorism is a reaction. Reaction to what? Reaction to unconscious, the emphasis on unconscious by Sigmund Freud, known as behaviorism, the second force in psychology in the West. So this is the first thing about behaviorism. It was a reactionary movement. It denied the supremacy of unconscious, which was emphasized so greatly by Sigmund Freud. So behaviorism was a reactionary movement. And reaction to what? Reaction to primary emphasis on unconscious, of the psychoanalysis, of the depth psychology, of the reductionism. And who founded this school of, or this movement in psychology? This viewpoint was first systematically stated by J.B. Watson. J.B. Watson was the founder of this behaviorism. The third thing According to Sigmund Freud, unconscious was the subject matter to be analyzed. আমি কি বস্তু আমি বিশ্লেষণ কৰিব লাগিব? Unconscious. যদি আমি যদি বাহ্য ব্যৱহাৰ, বাহ্য মানুহৰ মনৰ বিষয়ে যদি বিশ্লেষণ কৰিব খোজো, what is our subject matter? Subject matter is not the external mind. Our subject matter is unconscious. But Watson said, no, our subject matter is not unconscious. We do not agree. Then what should be our subject matter? Watson said, objectively observable behavior, which can be observed objectively. Objectively মানে আমি জানো বস্তুনিষ্ঠভাৱে, চকুৰে দেখা পাব লাগিব, ইন্দ্ৰিয়ই গম পাব লাগিব। আমি এই ভাৰতীয় সংস্কৃতি আৰু পাশ্চাত্যৰ মাজত মূল যিটো whole scientific world is being led and inspired by this empirical philosophy, this objectivity. They do not regard subjectivity as an element of truth. So, according to behaviorism, objectively observable behavior is the proper subject matter of psychology, not unconscious as founded by Sigmund Freud. So, আমি যেতিয়া মনস্তত্ব বুলিও কোৱা নাই, এইটো কৈছে হিউমেন বিহেভিয়াৰ বুলি কৈছে। মানৱীয় আচৰণৰ ক্ষেত্ৰত আমি যেতিয়া বিশ্লেষণ কৰিম, তাৰ বিষয়বস্তুটো আমি বস্তুনিষ্ঠভাৱে পৰ্যবেক্ষণ কৰিব পৰা হ'ব লাগিব। আৰু বস্তুনিষ্ঠ মানে তেওঁলোকে সেন্স, অৰ্থাৎ চকু কাণ নাক ছাল এইবোৰৰ দ্বাৰা গম পাব লাগিব। যদি এইবোৰৰ দ্বাৰা গম পোৱা নাযায়, তেনেহলে this is not the subject matter of psychology, according to behaviorism. তাৰপিছত কৈছে the subject matter of psychology must be capable of explaining as a response to internal and external stimuli. Must be capable of explaining as a response to internal and external stimuli. অৰ্থাৎ আমি যেনেকে জন্তুক কিবা এটা খাব দিছো, it is a stimuli. So we will observe what will be his response. ঠিক তেনেকে কৈছে মানুহৰ বিহেভিয়াৰটো কৈছে this objectively observable behavior must be capable of explaining as a response to internal and external stimuli. আন্তৰিকভাৱেও যদি কিবা এটা উত্তেজক দিয়া গৈছে আৰু বাহ্যিকভাৱেও যদি দিয়া গৈছে, তাৰ সঁহাৰিটো কি ধৰণে জনাইছে, তাৰ আচৰণত কি ধৰণে ফুটি উঠিছে, আমি সেই ধৰণৰ অবজেক্টিভলি অবজাৰ্ভেবল বিহেভিয়াৰে সাইকোলজিৰ সাবজেক্ট মেটাৰ হ'ব পাৰিব, নট আনকনসিয়াস অৰ ইনট্ৰস্পেকশন। কৈছে the subject matter of psychology must be capable of explaining as a response to internal and external stimuli. Then কৈছে ইয়াতো behaviorism খেলতো হোৱা নাই, কৈছে psychology must become a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Must be, not should be, must be, because psychology must become a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. You just recall when psychology emerged as an independent field of study in the West in its second stage of evolution. It was developed strictly as a natural science, strictly as a laboratory science, which is known as brass instrument psychology because of the centrality of the scientific instrument. It is also called brass instrument psychology, strictly developed as a laboratory science of natural laboratory science. So now psychology is returning to that second stage through behaviorism. So psychology must become a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. And this behaviorism, founded by Watson, deprecated introspection. Deprecated মানে খণ্ডন কৰা, deprecate কৰা মানে বিৰোধিতা কৰা, খণ্ডন কৰা, অস্বীকাৰ কৰা, deprecated introspection. Which আত্মানুসন্ধান cannot be a process or method of psychology. So It has to be an objective experimental branch of natural science and eschewed all hypothetical concept. Eschewed means tak erai choliboloi dhorile, avoiding. Because eschewed all hypothetical concept which are not capable of testing experimentally. And experimentally, but you should know empirical experiment, objectively verifiable. So subjective experiment, they will not agree to. So eschewed all hypothetical concepts which are not capable of testing experimentally. So what they did, they use rats, indoor. They use rats and other laboratory animals to study the behavior of human. They use rats and other laboratory animals. This is the irony with humanity by the Western world. Behavior of rat will determine the behavior of human being. So use rats and other laboratory animals. Another characteristics, the psychology once again became primarily a laboratory science. Though depth psychology, psychoanalysis was an advancement through behaviorism, psychology in the West once again became primarily a laboratory science. But there was a difference with the laboratory science of its earlier stage. There is a difference. Eta parthekyo ase jitu ditiyo porjayot ami ki koisilu brass instrument psychology koisilu. Kiyo brass instrument psychology koisilu? Because of the centrality of scientific instrument. Now all brass instrument psychology being replaced by what? Replaced by what is known as rat psychology. Induror monostottva, rat psychology. Earlier, it is strictly developed as a natural science. There was centrality of scientific instrument. Now, this brass instrument psychology is being replaced by rat psychology. And it was dominant in 1920s. বিংশ শতিকাৰ দ্বিতীয় দশকৰ সময়ত it was very powerful and dominant in the field of psychology. It was dominant in 1920s, now declining. Clinical practice continues to be dominated by psychoanalysis and other non-behavioristic approaches. কৈছে 1920 শতিকাৰ দ্বিতীয় দশক মানলৈ behaviorism was very খুব প্ৰবল হৈ আছিল. It was dominant. Now it is declining. আৰু ক্লিনিকেল যিটো সাইকোলজি বুলি মই কওঁ মনোচিকিৎসাৰ ক্ষেত্ৰত ফ্ৰয়েডৰ সাইকোএনালাইসিস is the dominant theory. আৰু কৈছে and other non-behavioristic approaches. There are other approaches too, similar to these four forces. But behaviorism continues to be occupying commanding position in the mainstream of academic psychology. Not in clinical psychology, but in academic psychology, behaviorism still occupying a commanding position. Behaviorism. Though apparently psychoanalysis and behaviorism are two distinctly and diametrically opposed to system, is it not? But there are certain similarities, and which is very disturbing for human being. Why they are disturbing? So psychoanalysis and behaviorism share one fundamental view in common. What is that fundamental view? Because they are diametrically opposed to each other in their viewpoints regarding the proper subject matter of psychology. According to behaviorism, the subject matter of psychology must be objectively observable behavior. And according to Sigmund Freud, Sigmund Freud psychoanalysis, it is the unconscious. It is the unconscious through psychoanalysis to determine our external behavior, because mind is like an iceberg. 9/10 of mind lies behind the mind, behind the surface mind. So the proper subject matter of psychology different, and even the appropriate method for studying it are different. One is laboratory science, rat psychology, other is through psychoanalysis. But still they share something common, some view in common. What is that common view? It's very disturbing for humanity. First, both regards the human being as essentially an animal organism. Both psychoanalysis founded by the great Freud and the behaviorism founded by great psychologist Watson, both regard human being as essentially an animal organism. But still we are fascinated by West. That is a different issue. And psychoanalysis now. The human being, like the animal organism, according to psychoanalysis. According to psychoanalysis, human being is driven exclusively, not partially. According to whom? According to Sigmund Freud, according to depth psychology, according to psychoanalysis, is driven exclusively by the psychobiological energies. Psychobiological energies of the id, the ego, and the superego. If I have time, I will be explaining what, according to Sigmund Freud, his whole unconscious is composed of three elements. One is called id, id. One is known by id. Second one is known by ego, ego, ego. Though it has a different connotation than from the Indian connotation. And the third one is the superego. So Freud's unconscious is composed of these three elements. And according to Freud, these three are exclusively driven by the psychobiological energies. Whether you will agree to or not, it's up to your wisdom. Whether we are essentially an animal organism, or human being is something else. It is to be decided by the modern progressive humanity. So the human being, like the animal organism, is driven exclusively by the psychobiological energies of the id, the ego, and the superego. And again, according to Freud, the whole characteristics of human being is constituted, rather is composed by these three elements only. We have nothing beyond id, ego, and superego. They alone constitute the sui generis. Sui generis means unique. So they alone constitute the unique characteristics of the human being. So your characteristics, my characteristics, has been constituted by these three elements alone. And they are exclusively driven by the psychobiological energies only, not by any other power, not by any other energy. And they do not alter the fundamental dynamics attributed to the animal organism. This is irony. So these three things, they do not alter the fundamental dynamics attributed to the animal organism. And the constant tendency to seek a state of homeostasis or internal equilibrium. According to Freud, আমি যে এটা internal equilibrium তাক homeostasis বুলি কৈছে. Homeostasis মানে কি? Let me explain. Homeostasis মানে কৈছে আমি এটা equilibrium. আমি যে আমাৰ মানুহৰ গোটেই হিউম্যান যেটো অর্গানিজম, এই হিউম্যান অর্গানিজমটোৱে we are only seeking to maintain an equilibrium. And what is this homeostasis? Homeostasis, a state of balance among all the body systems, needed for the body to survive and function correctly. So this is basically primary concept. So according to Freud, so they do not alter the fundamental dynamics attributed to the animal organism. And what is that fundamental attribution? The constant tendency to seek a state of homeostasis or internal equilibrium. এটা আমি আন্তৰিক ভাৰসাম্য এই যে আমাৰ বিভিন্ন বডিৰ পাৰ্টছবোৰ আছে তাৰ মাজত, অৰ্থাৎ সেইবোৰ ক'বলৈ গ'লে ক'ব লাগিব এই যিবোৰৰ মাজত কৈছে, অৰ্থাৎ যে ইন হোমিওষ্টেচিছ বডি লেভেল অফ এচিড, ব্লাড প্ৰেছাৰ, ব্লাড সুগাৰ, electrolytes, energy, hormones, oxygen, proteins, and temperatures are constantly adjusted to respond to changes inside and outside the body to keep them at a normal level. So let me now discuss what is, according to Sigmund Freud, id, ego, and superego. What are they? Because according to Sigmund Freud, whole human psychic apparatus, অর্থাৎ যেটো আমাৰ আন্তৰসত্তা কাৰ দ্বাৰা গঢ়ি উঠিছে এই তিনিটা বস্তুৰ দ্বাৰা. id I আৰু d, id, then ego and the superego. What is that? Is that Freud's personality theory saw the psyche মানে আমি এতিয়া বুজি লওঁ the innermost being or inner personality. Psyche is structured into three parts. প্ৰথম আমি জানিব লাগিব আমাৰ যেটো মনস্তত্ত্ব গঢ়ি উঠিছে তিনিটা বস্তুৰ দ্বাৰা, the id, ego, and the superego. তিনিটা বস্তু, all developing at different stages in our lives. বেলেগ সময়ত হি বিকশিত হয়. Then what is id? Id is the primitive and instinctive part of the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives and hidden memories. So what is id? Manuhor the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives and memories. So id hol amar jitu instinctive part boli koise, animal organism or id. And what is superego? The superego operates as a moral conscience. So superego is the moral agent of moral conscience. And what is ego? According to him, ego is the reality. So ego is the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the superego. So between conscience, moral conscience, and our aggressive sexual drives, who will be mediating? Ego will be mediating. So this is his psychoanalysis. The fundamental thing, id, ego, and the superego. And when ego needs to mediate, at what point of time? Because the basic dilemma of all human existence is that each element of the psychic apparatus makes demands upon us incompatible with the other two. Igor jitu dabi an dutar dabir logot nimile. Idor jitu demand an dutar logot nimile. গতিকে কৈছে যে এই যে মানুহৰ মনত বাহ্য মনস্তত্ত্বত যে আমাৰ অশান্তি, টেনচন, ডিপ্ৰেছন, নানা ধৰণৰ ঘটনা ঘটে, তাৰ কাৰণ কি কৈছে? the basic dilemma of all human existence is that each element of the psychic apparatus makes demands upon us incompatible with the other two. So inner conflict is inevitable. আমি যেতিয়া পশ্চিমৰ মনস্তত্ব আলোচনা কৰিছো, we are not rejecting the truth behind their analysis. There is truth, but these are not the whole truth. So please remember, there is truth, nothing is to be rejected. Sri Aurobindo says nothing is to be rejected, and nothing means nothing. Nothing is to be rejected, all has to be raised to the level of divine consciousness. So we are not rejecting existence of truth in this analysis, but these truths are not final. These are not the whole truth about human psychology. So inner conflict is inevitable. Then who will be mediating? For example, the superego can make a person feel guilty if rules are not followed. যদি কিবা আমি ধৰক সমাজত আমি নিয়ম পালন কৰা নাই, মোৰ বিবেকে মোক দংশন কৰিব পাৰে। কিন্তু আকৌ when there is a conflict between the goals of id and the superego, যেতিয়া মোৰ যে id যেটো সহজাত প্ৰবৃত্তিয়ে তাৰ যেটো অতৃপ্তি কি কিবা এটা তৃপ্তি লাভ কৰিব বিচাৰিছে, কিন্তু মোৰ সুপাৰ ইগো মৰেল কনসাইন্স এজেন্ট অফ মৰেল কনসাইন্সে তাত বাধা দিছে। There is a conflict between id and super ego. Who will be mediating? Because when there is a conflict between the goals of id and super ego, the ego must act as a referee. Ego act as a referee and mediate this conflict. The ego can deploy various defense mechanisms to prevent id from becoming overwhelmed by anxiety. So basically psychoanalysis of তেওঁলোকে ধৰি লৈছে মানুহৰ যেটো আমাৰ যেটো psychological disturbance হয়, it is because of the conflict between id and superego, or it is because of the dissatisfied sexual hunger, sexual drive. যদিও পিছৰে এজনে কৈছে it is not only composed by sex, it is also composed by hunger for power also. But Sigmund Freud concentrated only on sexual drive. So id is only composed with sexual drive according to Sigmund Freud. So this is these three elements are constituting his unconscious. The 9/10 of our unconscious, according to Sigmund Freud, is unconscious, and this unconscious is composed of these three elements: id, ego, and superego. So you can define id as our instincts. যেনেকে পশুৰ সহজাত প্ৰবৃত্তি থাকে, আমাৰ সহজাত প্ৰবৃত্তি, id is the instinct, superego is the morality, and ego is the reality. ঠিক এনেধৰণে বুজিব পাৰো। কিন্তু আমাৰ ভাৰতীয় ধাৰণাত, ভাৰতীয় মনস্তত্ব, ভাৰতৰ spiritual psychology, ego has a altogether and radically different conception. I'm telling you, radically. It's not a question of degrees only. The ego has totally a different conception. For India, ego is the separative consciousness. Ego separates me from the whole world, from the whole creation. So ego is the separative consciousness. So it will be discussed at an appropriate stage of our discussion. The ego in our own perspective will be explained and discussed. But at this point, what is to be noted, that ego as defined by Freud is not acceptable to India at all. Is not acceptable to India at all. I'm using the word at all. Absolutely not acceptable to India. So then what is then according to behaviorism? According to behaviorism, because now we are discussing what these two forces share in common. So according to the human behavior, according to behaviorism, is determined by same law of stimulus and response. Stimulus so is determined by the same law of stimulus and response. Aru kenake to discover kori? Because it is a rat psychology. So this law was discovered by Pavlov, another name of psychologist, in his experiment with dogs. So experimenting with dogs, they formulated a theory for human being, like psychoanalysis. It is, we are essentially animal organism, according to Freud as well as Watson, according to psychoanalysis as well as according to behaviorism. So this law was discovered by Pavlov in his experiments with dogs, and by the same principles of reward and punishment, which have been found by Sneaker and other new behaviorists to operate in laboratory animals. So these are the things psychoanalysis and behaviorism share in common. So this is the fundamental view both share in common, that essentially human being is essentially an animal organism. So by experimenting with dogs and rat, theory for humanity, theory for human being can be formulated according to Watson as well as Sigmund Freud. And according to Sigmund Freud, though it is getting away from the surface view and looking behind, still his unconscious, the conception of his unconscious is a restricted one, because human psychology is a very complex one. But according to him, it is the whole inner anatomy, inner subjective anatomy is composed by only these three things: id, ego, and the superego. So now Sri Aurobindo's observation. But before that, what is the irony for us? Thus, both are characterized by reductionism, and we have already discussed what is reductionism. This reductionism consists in an attempt to explain the complex behavior of the more highly evolved human organism. By what? In terms of the same psychology and biological principles applicable to the simpler behavior of the less evolved animal organism. This is the irony. কৈছে স্বল্প বিকশিত পশুৰ যিটো বায়োলজি, পশুৰ যিটো অৰ্গেনিজম, পশুৰ অৰ্গেনিজমৰ বিষয়ে কৰা গৱেষণাৰ দ্বাৰা তেওঁলোকে হাইলি ইভলভড হিউমেন অৰ্গেনিজমক বিশ্লেষণ কৰিবলৈ প্ৰয়াস কৰিছে। কৈছে this reductionism consists in an attempt to explain the complex behavior of the more highly evolved human organism by what? In terms of the same psychology and biological principles applicable to the simpler behavior of the less evolved animal organism. So let us now look into how Sri Aurobindo observes. Sri Aurobindo, in his synthesis of yoga, has emphatically declared that but an ordinary psychology which only takes mind and its phenomena at their surface value. কৈছে মন আৰু মনৰ লগত জড়িত যিবোৰ ঘটনা, তাৰ যিটো বাহ্য মূল্যৰ দ্বাৰা যিটো মনস্তত্বই অকল বাহ্য মূল্য গ্ৰহণ কৰে, কৈছে তেনেধৰণৰ মনোবিজ্ঞানৰ দ্বাৰা আমাৰ কোনো উপকাৰত নাহে। কৈছে but an ordinary psychology which only takes mind and its phenomena at their surface value will be of no value to us, will be of no help to us. It will not give us the least guidance বুলি কৈছে, আমাক অলপো সাহায্য নকৰে। Why? কৈছে still less can we find the clue in a scientific psychology with a materialistic basis. Both psychoanalysis and behaviorism is based on materialism. Human being treated as an animal organism only, alone. So still less can we find the clue in a scientific psychology with a materialistic basis, which assumes that the body and the biological and physiological factors of our nature are not only the starting point, but the whole real foundation. So according to West, আমাৰ সমগ্ৰ মানৱ মনস্তত্বৰ ভিত্তি কি কৈছে? the body, the biology and the physiological factors. Yes, it can be treated as a starting point. কিন্তু পশ্চিমে কি কৰিছে? কৈছে which assumes that the body and the biological and physiological factors of our nature are not only starting point but the whole real foundation, and regards human mind as only a subtle development from the life and the body. কৈছে শৰীৰ আৰু প্ৰাণৰ পৰাই যেন মন বিকশিত হৈছে। মন এটা পৃথক তত্ত্ব নহয়, আৰু সেইবাবে their psychology is basically physiology. Scrutiny of brain, scrutiny of nervous system, brass instrument psychology, behaviorism. So this is the irony. So scientific psychology, this is the irony, because scientific psychology with a materialistic basis, assuming the body, biological and physiological factors are not only starting point, but the whole real foundation. And regarding mind, regards human mind only as a subtle development from the life and the body. It is not consciousness. It is not altogether a different principle, but only a stage of sarira and prana, vital and the body. Tarpisot Mahariki, we have not rejected this observation as only starting point. That may be the actual truth of the animal side of human nature. But there is also an human side of human nature. Even there is a divine side of human nature. But West does not know. And that is why for West, this is not only starting point, it is the whole foundation. But we have not rejected. We do not reject the truth behind their observation, because that may be the actual truth of the animal side of human nature and of the human mind, insofar as it is limited and conditioned by the physical part of our being. Because Upanishad says we are not only composed of physical seed, আমি কেৱল অন্নময় কোষৰ দ্বাৰাই অৰ্থাৎ শাৰীৰিক কোষৰ দ্বাৰাই গঠিত হোৱা নাই, which is our almost you can call animal organism, অন্নময় কোষ, physical seed. Upanishad says this physical seed has been superimposed by another higher seed. And what is that seed? It is called pranamoya kosh. Pranamoya kosh. It is the vital seed. Pran is in English you can call pran as vital. Vital. And pranamoy kosh is not the last thing. This vital seed is again superimposed by another seed, which is known as manomaya kosh, the mental seed. Again, this manomaya seed has been superimposed by another higher seed, which is called Vijnanamaya kosh. Again, Vijnanamaya kosh has been superimposed by another kosha, another seed, which is known as Anandamaya kosha. We can ascend up to that Anandamaya kosha. We are not permanently imprisoned in our animal organism. So that is why we are not rejecting the truth behind this concept of animal organism. But this is only the starting point. It is not the whole foundation of human mind. And that is why Maharishi says that may be the actual truth of the animal side of human nature and of the human mind, insofar as it is limited and conditioned by the physical part of our being. Then Maharishi says, but the whole difference between man and the animal is that আমি মনস্তত্বৰ আলোচনা কৰোতে পশু আৰু মানুহৰ মাজত পাৰ্থক্য কৰিব লাগিব, because human being is not only composed by physical seat, it is also composed by vital seat, it is also composed by mental seat, it is also composed by Vijnanamoya seat, it is also composed by Anandamoya seat. But the whole difference between man and the animal is that the animal mind, as we know it, cannot get for one moment away from its origin. পশুৱে নিজৰ যিটো মূল যিটো অৰিজিন, মূল তাৰ পৰা কৈছে even for a moment cannot get away. কৈছে cannot get for one moment away from its origin, cannot break out from the covering and become something greater than its present self. কৈছে এনিমেলে তাতকৈ আৰু কি বৃহত্তৰ হ'ব নোৱাৰে তাৰ যিটো বৰ্তমানৰ তাৰ যিটো অৱস্থা, কিন্তু মানুহে but in man minds reveal itself as a greater energy. Mind itself is a greater energy, escaping from the restriction of the vital and physical formula of the being. কৈছে আমাৰ যিটো প্ৰাণময় কোষ আৰু অন্নময় কোষৰ ওপৰতো মনোময় কোষ আছে, বিজ্ঞানময় কোষ আছে, আনন্দময় কোষ আছে। গতিকে কৈছে যে পশুৱে নিজৰ যিটো মূল যিটো অৱস্থা তাৰ পৰা ওলাই আহিব নোৱাৰে, কিন্তু মানুহে অন্নময় সত্তাৰ পৰা প্ৰাণময় সত্তা, প্ৰাণময় সত্তাৰ পৰা বিজ্ঞানময় মনোময় সত্তা, মনোময়ৰ পৰা বিজ্ঞানময় আৰু বিজ্ঞানময় সত্তাৰ পৰা আমি আনন্দময় সত্তালৈ আৰোহণ কৰিব পাৰো। দিস ইজ আৱাৰ ডেষ্টিনি। কিন্তু ওয়েস্টার্ন সাইকোলজিয়ে কি কৰিছে, তেওঁলোকে যে this body and the biological and the physiological factors of our nature are not only the starting point but the whole real foundation, forgetting the real difference between man and the animal. আৰু তাৰ পিছত কৈছে যেনেকে আমি মনে যেনেকে গ্ৰেটাৰ মানে কৰিব পাৰে আনকি তাতো শেষ নহয়। কৈছে but even this is not all that man is or can be. He has in him the power to evolve and realize a still greater ideal energy. যিটো মই বিজ্ঞানময় সত্তাৰ কথা কৈছো, মনতকৈ ওপৰৰ এটা স্তৰলৈকে আৰোহণ কৰিব পাৰে। কৈছে which in its turn escapes out of the restriction of the mental formula of its nature. যেনেকে আমি শৰীৰৰ ইমপ্ৰিজনমেন্টৰ পৰা আমি আৰোহণ কৰি প্ৰাণময় সত্তাত আৰোহণ কৰিব পাৰো, প্ৰাণৰ আমি ইমপ্ৰিজনমেন্টৰ পৰা আমি ওলাই আহি আমি মনোময় সত্তাত আমি প্ৰৱেশ কৰিব পাৰো। মনোময় সত্তাৰো আমি যিবোৰ ৰেষ্ট্ৰিকশ্যন আছে সেইবোৰক আমি অভাৰকাম কৰি আমি বিজ্ঞানময় সত্তাত প্ৰৱেশ কৰিব পাৰো, which is greater than mind, আৰু আনকি বিজ্ঞানময় সত্তাৰ ওপৰতো আনন্দময় জগত আমি প্ৰৱেশ কৰিব পাৰো। Our destiny. So with this, let me conclude. If you want to interact, we can interact for a few minutes. Thank you and namaskar to all. And tomorrow we will be taking up the remaining two forces. In real sense, these remaining two forces are the real advancement in the evolution of Western psychological thought, which will be taken up tomorrow. One is called humanistic force, and the fourth one is called transpersonal force. In right sense, these last two forces are the real advancement in the evolution of Western psychological thought, which will be taken up tomorrow. So if you want to interact, you can interact for a few minutes.
নমস্কাৰ, মই আপোনাক অনুগ্ৰহ কৰি প্ৰশ্ন এটা সুধিব খুজিছিলো, অনুগ্ৰহ কৰি আপোনাৰ পৰা উত্তৰ বিচাৰিছো। হয়, এই বাকীখিনিলৈকে চব ঠিকেই সুন্দৰভাৱে আপুনি আগবঢ়াই লৈ গৈছে ব্যাখ্যাখিনি, কিন্তু যেতিয়া আমি শ্ৰী অৰবিন্দৰ দৰ্শনৰ ভিত্তিত মনস্তত্বক ব্যাখ্যা কৰিবলৈ আগবাঢ়িছো, সেই পৰ্যায়তে মনস্তত্বই এই যিটো অবজেক্টিভ চায়েন্স বা চাইণ্টিফিক অবজেক্টিভিটিৰ নেচাৰটো বা তাৰ চৰিত্ৰটো, হেৰাই পেলাব নেকি? কি বস্তুনিষ্ঠ নহয় ব্যক্তিনিষ্ঠ বিজ্ঞান হৈ পৰিব নেকি বা বিষয় হৈ পৰিব নেকি? মোৰ প্ৰশ্নটো তেনেকুৱা লাগিছে। মোৰ প্ৰশ্নটো সেইটোৱে মূল কথা। অনুগ্ৰহ কৰি আপুনি যদি অলপ ব্যাখ্যা কৰি দিয়ে।
Yes. Mind is a subjective element. Mind cannot be seen. Mind cannot be, যদি আপনি যদি কয় psychology according to India is a subjective science. And even in West also, only except the behaviorists, according to even for the psychoanalysis, even for the introspection, it is subjective science, because mind is something which exists within us. So psychology as well as spirituality is essentially a subjective science. It is, your observation is correct.
ধন্যবাদ. Thank you.
Because you love your mother. Can it be objectively proved? Yet it is a truth. Yet it is a truth. You love your mother, but it cannot be empirically proved. My mind, my inner feeling, how can be objectively interpreted? This is the irony of this stage, because we are living in the era of objectivity. That is সেইটো এটা পৃথক কথা। আমি বৰ্তমান বস্তুনিষ্ঠ যুগত বাস কৰিছো। বস্তুনিষ্ঠ মানেই হল বস্তুৰ বাহ্য সত্য। আমি বস্তুনিষ্ঠ যুগৰ পৰা we are heading towards age of, we are entering the age of subjectivity, slowly, slightly. এই যুগ ধৰ্ম হল মানুহে বস্তুৰ বাহ্য সত্যৰ ওপৰত আলোকপাত কৰিছে। আৰু সেইভাবে বিজ্ঞান ও পদাৰ্থ বিজ্ঞানে is concerned basically with the how of the world process. But physics is not concerned about the why of the world process. Jagat kyo? Why Jagat has come into existence? It is not right now the subject matter of physical science. Subject matter of physical science is how of the world process. But when they will যেতিয়া তেওঁলোকে প্ৰান্ত সীমাত উপনীত হ'ব, তাৰ পিছৰ পৰ্যায়ত তেওঁলোকে they will take up why of the world process. Because objectivity and subjectivity এটা মুদ্ৰাৰে ইপিঠি সিপিঠি. Without objectivity and subjectivity, both are part of reality. We cannot neglect neither of the two, any of the two. Both are part of truth. So, but in my opinion, as well as in the opinion of Indian psychology, psychology is essentially a subjective science. But it can be experienced in the laboratory of subjectivity. It can be experienced. All these things will be taken up. But your observation is correct. Psychology, we do not recognize psychology as an objective science. Psychology is a subjective science.
আপোনাক বহুত ধন্যবাদ। খুব সুন্দৰভাৱে আপুনি ব্যাখ্যা আগবঢ়ালে।
Thank you. আৰু কোনোবাই সুধিব কিবা? ইয়াৰ পিছৰ যিটো আমি কালি দুটা ফোর্স আলোচনা কৰিম, তেতিয়া ওয়েস্টে নিজেই অবজেক্টিভিটিক আপোনাৰ অতিক্ৰম কৰি গৈছে। পিছৰ দুটা যিটো হিউম্যানিস্টিক এন্ড ট্রান্সপার্সোনাল, এই চাৰিটা ফোর্সৰ ভিতৰত সাইকো এনালাইসিস, দেন বিহেভিয়ারিজম, দেন হিউম্যানিস্টিক ফোর্স, and the fourth one is transpersonal. This humanistic approach and transpersonal approach of the West is a radical shift. And এই দুটা পিছৰ এপ্ৰোচে অলপ ভাৰতবৰ্ষৰ লগত, ভাৰতৰ সাইকোলজিৰ লগত মিলা যেন আমাৰ অনুভৱ হয়। আৰু কোনোবাই সুধিব, or should we conclude?
Psychology
হয় কোনোবাই খুদিব কিবা আৰু
দিগন্ত দা
চলিনে কনক্লুড কিবা খুদিব নেকি
তাকে সাইকোলজি লাষ্টত মই সাইকোলজি কি কৈছিলে
সাইকোলজি ইজ এসেনশিয়ালি এ সাবজেক্টিভ সায়েন্স আত্মনিষ্ঠ বিজ্ঞান বস্তুনিষ্ঠ বিজ্ঞান নহয় আত্মনিষ্ঠ বিজ্ঞান সাবজেক্টিভ সায়েন্স এই কথাটো কৈছিল
ঠিক আছে দিগন্ত দা খুব সুন্দৰ ভাল লাগিলে
ধন্যবাদ
থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ
ধন্যবাদ
আত্মনিষ্ঠ আৰু বস্তু নহয় ঠিক আছে
It's a very nice presentation. So thank you.
Thank you
দিগন্ত দা
thank you
Sir, I think we can conclude.
yes
Yes, thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful insights. And I think it has been a very important session in terms of where you're taking this forward. The way you've been discussing about objectivity and subjectivity, which I think is a very fundamental question as such, at least in social sciences. So I think this is something very pertinent to be talking about. How do we deal with this problem of objectivity and subjectivity in disciplines such as psychology, even in disciplines such as sociology. So yeah, and I would like to thank you once again for this wonderful session. I would like to thank esteemed participants for joining us from different places. Thank you so much once again, and we look forward to the next session. That is tomorrow, same time. We will join at 7:45. It will begin at 8 and end at 9. Thank you so much, everyone, and good night. And thank you to my volunteers also, student volunteers and technical team, of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you and good night and namaskar to all. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, sir.